Everyone, I'm going to be talking about climate adaptation and impacts on floods from 2022. This is Joy Claire from Paul Simpson. So over the years, climate change has been shifting the pattern of extreme weather events in three different ways. These events are becoming much larger in their scale. They're occurring more and more in locations where they were previously non-experienced, and they're increasingly concentrated in developing countries. So it's really important, if you want to understand the welfare effects of climate change, that we design studies that are targeted specifically at studying large unforeseen shocks in developing countries. And in particular, we think it's really important to understand how the ultra-poor respond to these shocks, because these are the populations that are hardest hit, but also have the least flexibility to respond in real time given various resource constraints. So we study a really large unforeseen shock in Pakistan. The 2022 floods displaced 33 million people. News reports suggest that flooding was experienced in about a third of the country. While satellite data doesn't detect all of the local floods, even from satellite imagery, at least 10% of the country can be seen as being inundated. These floods are not only large, but they were also extremely unprecedented. So here I'm showing you a map of rainfall from August 2022, which is the peak of the floods last year. And now we compare it to the same time a year before, the same time 10 years ago, and the same time 20 years ago. One thing that really is striking from these maps is that the level of rainfall that was experienced is dramatically higher. So in August 2022, the level of rainfall that was experienced was about 500% above average over the last 10, 20, or 50 years. In addition, the epicenter of these floods is this southern province called Sindh. And another thing that's quite striking from these maps is that that's not an area that typically experiences a lot of rain. One exception is August 2012, when actually that was the last time that the province experienced what were then called major floods. But in August 2012, the level of rainfall that was received was about 15 millimeters on average in the province, and what was received in August 2022 was 500 millimeters. So these proportions and these locations are quite unprecedented in the history of the country. So in this setting, we're going to be asking the following questions. We're going to look at how ultra-poor rural households cope with the immediate impacts of a large and unforeseen shock. Then we're going to look at how these households make forward-looking investments to ensure against the possibility of future shocks. In particular, we're going to be looking at how the households change their migration patterns, their occupational choices, how they might change the composition of their assets, and their networks. For example, do they make their networks more spatially diversified if their specific location is more exposed to climate change? The type of model that we have in mind is a more standard consumption saving model where you have a household, it has some wealth of assets, it's hit by a climate shock, and then needs to draw on those assets to smooth consumption in the near term, but also possibly diversify those assets going forward to ensure against future shocks. The only difference is that we're taking a very expansive view of assets to include, for example, village networks, human capital investments, and so on. Next, in case we observe that there is limited adjustment, which is what anecdotally some of the news reports suggest, we'll investigate what types of barriers impeded adaptation. For example, if we see that a household continues to live in an area where agricultural productivity has really declined after the floods, we'll try to investigate, for example, whether there are credit constraints or other types of barriers that prevent them from. I'm not going to talk a lot about this in this talk, but this project, we're also hoping will speak to this existing literature on why there's the persistence of rural-urban productivity differences. Without a random shock, it's hard to know whether these seeming sources of misallocation across space and sectors is because there are frictions that prevent people from reallocating, or if it's just selection. People are sorting according to their preferences, their skills, their abilities. Floods shock some of these frictions in a number of ways. Some of the frictions that are well documented to affect. For example, if distance to possible candidate migration destination prevents someone from migrating, floods in displacing people will shock that distance. If it's the presence of village networks that make someone more inclined to stay in their village, in dispersing those networks, floods might shock this episode of friction. Finally, agricultural households in particular may have lots of sector or location-specific assets, like livestock, like tractors that are part of the road, maybe a part of the town. Floods may either destroy the stock of these assets or destroy markets that can be used to liquidate these assets. And therefore, in making some of these frictions worse or better, our net floods plausibly exogenously shock these frictions, and so we'll be able to tell you whether a shock to these frictions affects households' migrations. We're able to do all of this with the help of a large NGO that operates in this province. This NGO operates with the help of village networks that deliver social protection programs locally on behalf of the NGO. Through these village networks, we'll be able to track, despite the flooding, 5,000 rural ultra-poor households in the province of Sindh, which would be epicenter of floods that I referenced earlier. These households are going to be sampled based on pre-flood characteristics. They're going to vary in their exposure to flooding, and we're going to survey them at 3 monthly intervals over a period of 3 to 5 years to understand how the impacts of flooding have evolved over time. Our argument in this paper is going to be that flooding is a random shock, and therefore we're going to be able to compare households that are relatively more flooded to households that are relatively less flooded to give you the causal impact of flooding. We're also going to explore heterogeneity within the flooding to try to understand what types of household characteristics enable more or less adaptation. So the data we're using in this study, we have at baseline characteristics of the villages through a census of all villages in the country in 2022. More importantly, we have in the districts where we're going to be surveying a geotag census of households, where we observe the location of those households, a large index of assets those households had in 2017, the size of the household, and for each member of the household, their previous occupation and level of education. We're going to use this both as our sampling frame and as our data. In addition, post-flood, we observe shortly after the floods, the level of damages that were experienced by households across the entire province, whether these were concrete or non-concrete households. This is a property level data set that tells us what the flooding did at a very local level. Combining with gridded population data, we're therefore able to estimate flood exposure at very granular levels. And what's upcoming is a survey that we're working on of these 5,000 households. This will be the first that we do after the floods occurred, and of course combine this with various types of sampling. So there's a number of considerations that guided our sampling. Our partner NGO operates in 6 of about 20 districts in the province. So those are the districts that we're going to be operating in, because it helps both with tracking the households to have access to their village networks, and also that's where we have baseline. Within these districts, we're going to keep our sampling relatively spatially concentrated to economize our survey costs. Within each district, we're going to have a mix of more and less flooded areas so that we can have district effects. And finally, we're going to exclude households that live very close to the river so that we preclude the possibility that these are households that are used to being flooded because they're seasonally kept flooded. These considerations give us the map over here, the thick boundaries of the various districts, and within the labeled districts, those are the 6 districts that we'll be going to. And within each of them, as you can see, we have a mix of flooded and non-flooded, and near spatial concentration. Okay, so our empirical specifications as follows, as I kind of referenced this earlier. We're going to proxy for flooding through rainfall, and I'll talk more about it in a bit. But in general, we're going to be looking at places that experience relatively more rainfall and comparing them to places that experience relatively less rainfall. And our assumption over here is that rainfall in particular and rainfall-induced flooding is random with respect to the potential outcomes. So to talk more about our identification assumption and why we think that the floods that we're experiencing in Pakistan are random, I'll go through a series of slides. Our first argument is that flooding is random because the type of flooding that was experienced in Pakistan was rainfall induced. This was not one particular dam that was breaking down or like one river that was overflowing its banks and leading to localized flooding in adjoining areas. As you can see in these maps over here, the pattern of rainfall quite strongly predicts the level of damages that were experienced in the province. So this is just the scale of both the rainfall and the damages as well as the pattern tells you. So this isn't like an infrastructural event that occurred in one local area. In addition, the level of rain that was experienced and the resulting floods were not anticipated. So here I'm showing you a 50-year average of rainfall in the province. And then overlaid on it are the results of a survey that we ran with the staff of the NGO that we're working with in our sample areas right after the floods occurred. The black dots show staff members telling us that their village was quite heavily flooded. The white dots show the staff member telling us that their village was less flooded. And while this is a small sample and it's non-rigorous, I think what stands out is that there's a large clustering of black dots at the top. There's clearly more flooding going on in the north. This aligns with news reports, and more white dots at the bottom. And this is in stark contrast to the pattern of rainfall that has been experienced in the past couple of years. So historical rain could not possibly have predicted what's happening right now. The other reason that there were no anticipation effects is that the speed of flooding was so rapid that it allowed no room for strategic response by households or by government to move out of harm's way in some plausibly emergent way. Because if you look at the level of rain that was experienced in the beginning of August and at the end of August compared to the middle of August, you can see that the bulk of the damages that the flood did were all concentrated within like this 1 week in the middle that kind of came out of nowhere. And that's the reason why the damages were so devastating, because there's very little time for government to respond or to coordinate to get people out of it. So this was an unforeseen shock. And finally, in trying to study this shock, we're going to end up comparing areas that we think are otherwise geographically quite similar, but differ only in their exposure to flooding. So here I'm showing you a map of elevation in Pakistan, and these black polygons at the bottom are sample areas. So what stands out about these sample areas is that relative to the rest of the country, these are all low-lying and flat areas. And when land is completely flat and mostly landlocked, it means that when it rains on it, the water will collect, and the intensity of that rainfall will be determined, the intensity of that will be determined by how much it rains, amongst other factors. So overall, to wrap up this section, across areas that receive more and areas that receive less rain, we're going to ultimately be comparing ultra-poor and rural households who live in low-lying and rural areas. Our sample therefore is balanced on most important outcomes. In the event that there are certain unobservables that we're not able to account for in this comparison, we will expose be able to rebate or to implement some form of matching or synthetic control using A, the baseline data that we have from 2017. And then B, recall data, which we will be collecting. So in case there are unobservables that we don't observe in 2017, for example, migration histories of households or housing quality in the village, we'll be able to collect that data in the survey that we're just launching shortly. And then finally, village levels. So just to conclude, we're now at this point in the project working really hard on putting together a survey, and it'd be great to hear your thoughts on outcomes that we should collect. What we're focusing in this survey on at the moment is as I said, using recall to collect some of the baseline variables that we have. Then trying to estimate the size of the block for households in terms, for example, of damages that have mentioned. Trying to understand what types of coping strategies these households are implementing. So, for example, selling assets, readjusting their labor supply, taking new loans for migrating. Trying to understand what their beliefs are about the possibility of future shocks and how these beliefs evolve over time. For example, monsoon is around the corner, and we'd like to understand what types of actions they're taking in anticipation. And then we'll ask them what they intend to do in the next few months. For example, we'll ask them what types of work and what types of behaviors might you intend to undertake in the next 3 months, the next 6 months. Then we resurvey them at the 3 and 6 month intervals to see if they have been able to execute those plans. And in case they weren't able to, we will ask them questions to understand what barriers got in the way that prevented them from doing so. Okay, that's fine. Thank you.